After yesterday's result and performance in the Australian Grand Prix, Ferrari reiterated the issues with the SF-25, a Formula One car that is currently not performing properly. There was quite a bit of anticipation for the Prancing Horse. This is evidenced by the crowd seen at the Fiorano circuit a few weeks ago, with Lewis Hamilton's debut behind the wheel of the SF-23 and the first filming day of the season with the new car. The excitement was through the roof, but it started to wane during Saturday's qualifying session and then completely faded the following day, alongside the dreadful race from the red car. Positions don't matter, but race pace does. Before focusing on this main issue, it is worth pointing out that Charles Leclerc took responsibility for his mistake. We are referring to the spin in the second part of the race, which cost him several positions. A problem not entirely his, as by looking at the telemetry, it is clear that the Monegasque driver didn't do anything different from the previous lap. The real issue was more related to the deteriorating track conditions, which further reduced the car's grip. Still, a very mature attitude from the Monegasque driver in front of the F1 microphones. Charles Leclerc claims that without that spin, he could have finished fourth or even on the podium. We won't say that's untrue. However, assuming that what the Ferrari driver claims had indeed happened, what would have changed? Without a doubt, earning more points and reaching the third step of the podium would have been beneficial. That's clearly true. But was that Ferrari's goal for the 2025 Formula One season? Scrambling for a third place using the safety car? What really matters, beyond the result, is the poor race pace shown by the SF-25 cars, which were completely incapable of fighting at the front. At least 2 seconds slower than the McLaren's. Embarrassing. It's unacceptable. And this is where we need to start from, not from the missed third place, or Charles Leclerc's small lack of focus. In the end, it rained at the 5.278-kilometer Albert Park Grand Prix circuit in Melbourne, as had been expected for some time thanks to weather forecasts available from Météo France. Even on a wet track surface, the SF-25 continued to underperform. In fact, it managed to do worse than on Saturday on dry conditions. Yet, the most widespread rumor was that the team had sacrificed qualifying to focus on the race, which was supposed to be wet. Extreme wet setup, they had said. First of all, let's clarify one thing. We do so with the direct involvement of the key figures. Nowadays, in Formula One, there are no huge differences between a wet setup and a dry setup. Those with a good memory will recall Carlos Sainz's comments from last year's Brazilian Grand Prix. We quote him directly. The truth is that nowadays there is no such thing as a wet setup. There's just the brake duct, which you tweak to modify the tire temperatures. Then that's it. These were the exact words of the Spaniard when he was driving the SF-24 last year. As a side note, let's reflect. It is objectively true that a more loaded rear wing helps reduce the car's sliding. However, Ferrari did not choose the rear wing specification on Thursday with Sunday in mind. The decision for a more loaded wing is strategic, to follow the procedure already implemented last year, namely to optimize the balance around a stable rear load value. There was also talk of increased ride heights. At this point, we cannot rule out that some adjustments were indeed made, as it is always crucial over the weekend to avoid problems with the skid block thickness. However, this factor is completely unrelated to the idea that such a change was made to create an extreme wet setup. Then there is the mechanical issue, which is also incorrect. It was said that Ferrari, in an effort to support the extreme setup goal, had chosen to generally soften the car's suspension. The reality is different. As with rain, such changes are no longer made from this perspective, and we believe that this was made crystal clear yesterday. What would the supposed benefits of these choices made by Ferrari be? Going 2 seconds per lap slower than McLaren? Not being able to pass a Williams? Finishing behind Lance Stroll? Scoring as many points as Sauber's Mattia Binotto with only Nico Hülkenberg? One last thing. The rain was expected for everyone. Ferrari did not have a conversation with Nostradamus, acquiring this information exclusively. Every team knew about it. And look at that. Without the extreme wet setup, McLaren and Red Bull were more stable and faster, even with the famous dry setup. What a mystery. Leaving aside the story about the SF-25 wet setup and looking back on the Maranello team's performance this weekend in Australia, we recall that just on Friday, team principal Frédéric Vasseur had been prophetic in the press conference. The French manager had said that during the winter period, everyone felt like world champions. But once the first qualifying of the year arrived, they were brought back to reality. He also mentioned that they had 2 months of marketing, which had been a huge wave. He emphasized that the most important thing was to turn the page and return to their usual business. Frederick Vasseur noted that it would be a long road with about 150 sessions throughout the year, and they needed to focus on that and forget about the world around them. A world of passionate fans, so dedicated to Ferrari that they flooded Fiorano during the debut days of the SF-25 and the center of Milan during the presentation at Piazza Castello. A red wave properly excited by routine statements aiming for the World Championship, iconic photos, and a lot of marketing. And now it looks lost at the horizon of a season that, more than Ferrari red, has started in McLaren orange, Max orange, and Mercedes gray. Then came the Saturday in Melbourne, giving a harsh jolt to Ferrari's Australian dreams. Suddenly, it took a step backward like a crab. Whispers about an SF-25 single-seater raised to avoid excessive wear on the plank and a performance window that has gone off the radar. And it was 7th and 8th place in qualifying. A disastrous result, further worsened in the race, with Charles Leclerc finishing 8th and Lewis Hamilton 10th. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Wrong strategy, but to quote the Ferrari team principal, it's easy to say that in hindsight, driver mistakes, the usual car deficit in the wet, comical team radio messages with the race engineers, with Charles Leclerc explaining he had the seat full of water, and the radio reply being, "It must be water," with the Monegasque sarcastically replying that was a pearl of wisdom. Looking beyond, in short, the Ferrari fans were hoping for a red dawn, and they are faced with an infrared dawn, in the sense that we are asked to go beyond what our eyes allow us to perceive, to hope for the invisible. We are told it is only the first of 24 races. We are told that dominating the first race does not mean winning the Formula One championship. We are reminded where McLaren was exactly 2 years ago. We must look beyond, which of course is often what lovers do. But yesterday, with a P8 and a P10 behind McLaren, Red Bull, Mercedes, Williams, Aston Martin, and even Mattia Binotto's Sauber, perhaps it's asking too much of fans. Charles Leclerc is now hoping to see improvements from Ferrari going forward regarding its pace in changing conditions. The Italian side was unable to match the pace of McLaren and Red Bull during the Australian Grand Prix, leaving the Monegasque driver to scratch his head over the margin. Charles Leclerc explained to the media that Ferrari's performance was somewhat comparable to Mercedes at the front, but that was the extent of it. He acknowledged that McLaren and Red Bull were significantly faster, adding that there was a lot of work to be done. When asked about Ferrari's struggles, particularly in those conditions, he admitted that he didn't yet know the exact cause, but at the same time, the Ferrari driver revealed that the issue with SF-25's pace in changing conditions had been a persistent problem for the Maranello team over several years. Charles Leclerc noted that it had been a weakness for quite some time, as the team had shown inconsistent performance in wet and damp conditions. He emphasized the need for improvement in this area. Late in the race, when heavy rain began to affect the circuit, Ferrari initially decided to keep its drivers out on dry tires, hoping the gamble would pay off in the final laps. However, the team was ultimately forced to admit defeat and pit both drivers, costing them additional points and dropping them to the edge of the points positions. Reflecting on the race, Charles Leclerc acknowledged that it had been a missed opportunity. He explained that, especially in changing conditions when the team lacked pace, that was the crucial moment to score points, but Ferrari had failed to do so. He also noted that the team had not been fast enough in the early stages when the race was relatively uneventful, and when it became critical to make the right decisions, they did not manage to do so.